Beginning our Daf Mesechta Rosh Hashanah Daf, begin 10 lines down at the top of the Amud, where we first just finish off the discussion we had from the previous Daf, discussing the unique discussion of when was the world created. It was created in Nisan or Tishrei, and then we continue to explain the halacha by Mishnah regarding the different Rosh Hashanahs that there are in the year. Shiur's Kos Bazarkasik and Cheskel to anytime Daf. Hashem B'Shem for joining us today's Daf. Some of the things we're going to discuss in today's Daf are one of the Rosh Hashanahs we mentioned in the Mishnah is that for Meiser. And the halachas of Meiser are that produce grown in 1 year. I mean, what does it mean in Rosh Hashanah? If it's grown in 1 year, it can't be mixed with produce of another year for the purposes of Meiser. So that's why it's important to know what's the cutoff, what's the new year, because you can't mix 1 year's produce with another. Additionally, that the cutoff day for determining the 2 years is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. That's the Rosh Hashanah for Meiser. Meiser, we discussed two different types of Meiser. We have Meiser Dagan, that of the grain, Dog and Tish V'Yitzah, which is very nice. And then Meiser Yerek, which is Durabanan, that is not biblically obligated, but is a rabbinic type that we mentioned today's Daf. Meiser Sheni and Meiser Ani is that there's a 7-year Shemitah cycle. In the Shemitah year, everything is ownerless. For the first and the second and the fourth and the fifth year, besides Meiser Rishon, you take of Meiser Sheni. In the third and the sixth year, you take of Meiser Ani. So instead of Meiser Sheni, which you take of a Yid Yerushalayim, Meiser Ani is given to the poor. And that's Meiser Dagan by the biblical typing of the grain, is that we first take off Truma, and rabbinically that's 1 out of 50. That's the ratio. And then you take off the Meiser Rishon, which is 1/10, and the Meiser Sheni, another 10th, and again, or Meiser Ani, depending on the year. But the Derm Halach Achaloshim Ne'adim is the concept that although biblically a terminology might mean one thing, but by vows, we don't go based on, let's say, on Torah's wording. We go based on how people normally speak, and therefore that is what's keveya for the person's neder. Hamudim mechaver is the halacha that someone took a vow prohibiting himself to have benefit from his friend, that he's limited, obviously not being able to have pleasure from him. Shemitah, as we mentioned, is the 7th year where everything is considered as hefker, and everyone could go out and take from everyone else's things. Meiser behema is, besides that, we know what's called meiser. You take 1/10 of your grain. There's also halacha of meiser behema, which is the animals that are born that year. Every 10th animal is designated as meiser behema, and if it's unblemished, you bring it as a carbon. If it's blemished, then the owner eats it as for himself. So we continue from the previous Daf, just finishing off basically the discussion on Daf Yud's 10 lines down at the top of the Amud, where we had discussed this machlekes Tanoim, Rabbi Shloimy, if the world was created in Nisan or Tishrei, and hence the discussion regarding as of what happened by the Mabul. Was it in the 17th of Cheshvan, or was it in the 17th of the year, depending on what's the first month of the year, because it was in the second month. So Talmud Linda Braisa, concluding the discussion, Chachmi Yisrael, the Jewish sages, Meinin Lamabul Krebelezer. They count the years of Noach and the creation of the world and the years of the generations, like Rabbi Eliezer, which is they count the year starting from Tishrei. So hence, they say, the Chachmi Yisrael, that the Mabul was on the 17th of the year. Now, not because they hold, as Rashi explains, as the Gemara is about to say, that the world was created in Tishrei, rather simply because Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for the years. Thank you, sir. Meaning, when it comes to calculating years, then the next year starts by Tishrei. But actually, the world was not created in Tishrei according to the Chachmi Yisrael. It's actually created in Nisan. And therefore, it's kufa. When it comes to calculating the seasons regarding the solar and the lunar accounts, the calculations, it's actually krib yeshua. So when you're going to count the tkufas, which go based on the sun, and when you're going to count the moilid, which is based on the moon, you're going to count from Nisan to say that the world was created in Nisan. So that's why Rashi explains that in the beginning of, we know, every child knows that what was created on Yom Revi were the mo'ivos. Now, everyone learned about this, and we did a nice video on the Beberchas Lachama, that when the day starts, it started at 6 p.m., so to speak. That's on the perfect day. That's when Yom Revi started, and that's when the Ma'ires were put up into the sky. So that's why Tkufas Nisan is always, as the Gemara tells in Erevin Daf Nevam and Aleph, by the quarters of the day, by quadrants, because you always have, between one tkufa and another tkufa, you have a day and a quarter. Because it's 91 days, it's 90, which is equally divided, and you have a day and a quarter that takes you further from the previous tkufa. If you divide the whole year, 365, you divide it into 4, you're going to get those numbers. And that's why it's always going to be by a quarter. It's going to be 6, 12, 6, or 12, right? 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. or 12 a.m. or 12 p.m. because that's how much each season is continuing, and that's when it started by 6 p.m. on Wednesday. By that's when you're going to count the tkufa from, and so to the Moiled, you count the Moiled of the first Nisan on Tuesday night, what's called Leil Revi, 9 hours and 642 chalakim. Why it's that amount? Actually, you can look at Tais and Avchaz, which it goes through interesting why that would be. One pshat is because the Levana was Neig Nezifa in itself, because it was said Shtei Malachim B'Keser Echad, and therefore it like went behind the sun. Tais says no, we don't find the source of that. This goes through the calculations to show. We go through the Shana Shal Toihu, which is actually the year before the world was created. But Al Kapanim, when we're going to calculate, which is going to make a huge difference, when are we starting the cheshbon from? We count the tekufas from Nisan. Although when it comes to the calculation of the years, let's say by the Mabul, we actually go based on that of like Rabbi Eliezer from Tishrei. Whereas but the sages of the world, the non-Jewish sages, they count even the Mabul from Rabbi Shua. In other words, when they're counting the years of the generations, they start from Nisan, and therefore they say the Mabul was in the second month, which was in Iyar, where obviously that when it says in the Achas V'Sheish Meis, when it was in the 601st year of Noach, Berishon, the first month, that Chor V'Amayim, the water dried up, obviously that was Nisan, because we know that the judgment of the Mabul was 12 months, and therefore the second month couldn't have been Cheshbon, it had to be that it was in Iyar, because they hold that the count, as we see the 601st year, the counting of the generations is from Nisan, not like the Chachmei Yisrael that count the years from Tishrei. Now we continue with the halacha of the Mishnah that we said. Another thing that Aleph Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for is Uli Yerakis, was for the vegetables. So Tana within the Brisa actually elaborates on certain related things. It adds on more to the list, as we have in other things in previous dafim. The Brisa is added on more than what we said in our Mishnah. So a Brisa actually says Yerakis, which what does that mean? It means the meiser of yerek, of vegetables. The place discusses is specifically vegetables or anything, and in contrast to other types of fruits, or just not dug into Yitza. But regarding meiser of yerek, regarding the new and the old, when Allah is you'll not take truma from the yerek which was nilkat, as we'll discuss that idea. There's a question regarding certain types of produce. When is it considered that you're saying? Is it the year that it develops? Is it the year when it's harvested? When it takes root? So regarding Yerakis, it's regarding when it's nilka, when it's actually gathered. So if those were gathered Erev Rosh Hashanah, those are gathered after Rosh Hashanah, so they cannot be combined together. So regarding Yerakis is Rish Chodesh Tishrei, and Ula Maisis regarding the tithing, Ula Nadarim, and those are regarding vows, which we can explain on Amid Beis what that halacha is. Now the Gemara wonders, this Brisa has two terms that seem to be redundant, because the Brisa is saying Li Yerakis. So, what is that? Like we said that term in our Mishnah too. That Aleph Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for vegetables. So what is that? It's Ma'aser Yerek. It's the tithing of the vegetables. So wait a second. Hainu Ma'asus. That's exactly what Ma'asus is tithing. It's taking the tenth of your produce. Well, no. Tana de Rabbanan. First, the Tana let you know that there's a permanent Rosh Hashanah for the new and the old by Ma'aser Yerek, even though it's a rabbinic. And then with Tani Deraisa, then it tells you us regarding biblical Ma'aser, which is Ma'aser Dagon from grain, that even that has a permanent day, that where it's like a cutoff line, that's the new and the old, that you can't mix them. But then the Gemara says, if that's the case, listen to the Deraisa B'Reisha. Why do you say biblical law first? Why are you saying Yerakis and then Ma'aser? Shouldn't you first say Ma'aser is referring to Dagon and then Yerakis, which is the rabbinic law? So the Gemara, no. And this everyone knows from the beginning of Yavamis, where we learned that I did the Chavibile, that since it's dear to them because it's learned that through a Josh, it's like your own shtickle Torah. This is the guy has his vart in the parsha, and he's like fakaying you his vart. It's because it's his einfal. So the Chacham, since it's dear to them, aktame. So they went and they said it first. So that's why they said Yerakis first. Now, okay, that explains the Brisa. It says the Gemara B'Tana Didan, the Tana of our Mishnah, that taught Yerakis and didn't mention the terminology of Maasers. Why not? Why didn't he mention that for both of them the Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Tana de Rabbanan, we told you the rabbinic law, because that's what the term Yerakis means, and we told you that it has a set day, which is a cutoff date, that it's separating the years. But Koshkin, they're right. For sure, if rabbinic law has a cutoff day, for sure biblical law is going to have a cutoff day that it's going to be considered as a different year, which that's the biblical law that you can't share from one year and another year. Then the Gemara has a technical question. Why are you saying in the Brisa mais rois? But listening meiser, why don't you say in the singular? Because you're talking about only one type of meiser, which is meiser dagan, the typing of the biblical meiser of dagan. So it says no, because it's actually alluding to another biblical meiser. Echad meiser behema, vechad meiser dagan. It's referring to here in the Brisa that not only meiser dagan, which is the biblical law of separating on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, it's referring to meiser behema, which we had mentioned that in our Mishnah too, that was a machlekes, was echad be'el, echad be'tishrei, but this Brisa, when it's saying meiser is referring to both meiser behema and meiser dagan. So it's okay, but listen to Yerek. The Gemara is asking another technical question. Why does it say in the plural, Yerakais? Shouldn't it say Yerek? It's one type of rabbinic meiser of vegetables. That's the Rosh Hashanah's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. It says Gemara, no, Treikam the Yerek. It's actually alluding to two types of rabbinic meiser of Yerakais. What does that mean? What are two types? So Gemara says, I'll tell you, it's not like learning the Mishnah Masechtas meisers. It depends how you process your Yerakais to tell you when your Rosh Hashanah, when the thing is considered complete, to say which year is in. As the Mishnah explains, Yerek HaNeged, regarding Yerakis, vegetables that are generally tied together. That's how they process it. So then Mishayeged, when is it considered Goyrin? Goyrin is the terminology we always use to say that it's considered ready, finished its process, and now it's obligated in Meisers. It's considered Goyrin LaMaisa and forbidden to eat from it even as a snack until you take Meiser when you bind it together. If you didn't bind it together, it's not even considered finished yet and you could snack on it. But it's not usually bound. It's when you fill up the vessel, which Taisa says, and the Sefer they mentioned, you don't even fill up the vessel, it's when you malak it called tzarka, but they can have different times, and therefore we said it in the plural to tell you all types of Yerakas. The Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Again, the question is if it became mechuyev yet or not. That depends if you're ma'agid it or if you're not. Now, talking about one of the Brisa, which the Brisa here is coming to tell you, as we alluded to this earlier, that Yerakis, vegetables, in regards to the laws of Meiser, you go, like you're saying, okay, the years, but the years of what? Like, things grow, and then so you're saying the cutoff is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, okay, but what had to have been before? What's considered from the previous, before Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, what's considered after? What's considered that it was Mechuyev and Meiser from last year? It depends on Lakita. It goes on when you actually gather it, when you harvest it. Now, even if it grew in 1 year, but when you malaked it, you picked it in 2 different years, that's going to be old and new, which you cannot take truma from the new on the old, like it says in the pasuk, Ram Yadal, which is the source of the whole halacha we're saying here in this daf, of shana. Every single year is independent. That's what we're saying, that we have the biblical law. We're saying the rabbinic law has the same thing too, but the point of this Brisa is coming to tell us this idea that it goes based on the Likita, the Brisa says, which is what we're discussing over here, Yerakis. The Brisa says, Likat, if someone gathered the Yerek, he plucked it, he picked it, the Yerek, the vegetable, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Mamish, the Erev Rosh Hashanah, actually Tov HaShemesh before the sun sets, and then he goes and he gathers and continues to come in base when the sun sets, which Taisa obviously says from the Yishami that obviously it's a non-Jew because Rosh Hashanah Banach, Noch Kol Nidre, whatever, Noch the Davin and whatever, not Kol Nidre, but I'm saying he's not going to be picking the vegetables, but if a non-Jew picks it, Mamish, right after Shkia, ain't term Asim Zalzah. Even though the Mamish a few hours apart, you cannot take Trumas and from one on the other. And the reason for that is, Lufisha in term Asim. You cannot take Trumas or Meiser, not from the new grain on the old one. We're talking about vegetables. Not from the old one on the new one. And that's what we're telling you because it goes based on Lakitos. Even though the Mamish grew the same season, it doesn't make a difference. It goes based on when you pick it. Now, moreover, let's say we're saying it's Mamish Rosh Hashanah. Okay, Erev Rosh Hashanah, a few hours later the Nachi picked it Rosh Hashanah by night. It was the second year of the Shemitah cycle going into the third year. So Shniya, in other words, what was picked in the second year of the Shemitah cycle is Meiser Rishon. It's going to be Meiser Rishon, and that means that goes to the Levi. And the Meiser Sheni, which you eat in Yerushalayim. Now Shlishis, what was picked in the third year, Mamash a few hours later, Rosh Hashanah by night, it's already in the third year of the Shemitah cycle, is Meiser Rishon and Meiser Ani, as we mentioned in the introduction, that the first type that always goes to the Levi. And then the second type, instead of taking up and eating Yerushalayim, is given to the poor. Now the Gemara actually says, non-immediately, where do we know this idea from? That the third year, you don't have the laws of Ma'aser Sheni of the second tithe, and rather you have Ma'aser Ani. So Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg says a pasuk in the Dvar. Pasuk says, "Ki sachalo la'aser," it's called Ma'aser Tibu Ascha. When you're going to finish giving all your tithes of your grain, B'shana Shlish in the third year, Shnas HaMaiser, the year of the tithe. Now this is the diuk. It's in the singular. It says Shnas HaMaiser, as if there's one Maiser in the third year, which is Shana Shein Ba'ela Maiser Echad. It's a year that only has one tithe. Meaning, from the two tithes that you took in the previous year, that you took on Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Sheni, this third year is called Shnas HaMaiser in the singular. You're not going to do one of the tithes that you did last year. So, okay, so what does that mean? So the Bryce explained. So Rabbi Shloimy explained. It says Ma'aser Rishon, the first tithe that you're going to give as you always gave up until now. Or Ma'aser Ani, and now you're going to add on the poor man's tithe, which that's going to take the place of Ma'aser Sheni. Like the pasuk says in the Varm Chavav, like Gerli Yosem Amona, to the convert, to the orphan, to the widow, which is Ma'aser Ani, that's what you can give in the third year. Or Ma'aser Sheni Yivatel, and you're not going to go ahead and give any more Ma'aser Sheni. Or Yeina Ela Av Ma'aser Rishon Nam Yivatel. So that's what the Gemara is. That's what Rabbi Shloimy is initially interpreting. But the problem is, maybe actually that you're not even going to give Ma'aser Rishon to the Levi. Why? Because it was said Shnas HaMaiser. It says in the singular, which is only one Ma'aser that you're going to do. That's the one that the pasuk says La Levi La Gerber Yosef Amona, which, as Rashi explains, although it says La Levi over there in the third year, so how could you say you're not going to give Ma'aser Rishon? So Rashi explains, no, that's together with the Ger Yosef Amona, where Ma'aser Ani, the Levi is also an Ani. He doesn't have a chelik ba'aretz, so it means that you give only Ma'aser Ani. So how do you even know that you give Ma'aser Rishon? Maybe the one tithe you're giving is actually only Ma'aser Ani. How do you know it's Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Ani, and just you're not doing Ma'aser Sheni? Maybe you shouldn't even do Ma'aser Rishon. No, as a presentation by Midbar, it says Ve'el halaviyim to daber. To Levim you should speak. Vermatlim you should tell them. Kisikhu meis b'nei. So when you're going to take from the Jewish people esa ma'aser shenazati lechem mi'item menachal aschem, the tithing that I give to them, that's from them, from their inheritance. Nahikisha kosam nachal. The pasuk is equating ma'aser for the Levi to a nachala, to inheritance. Why do you have to mention that word me'item menachal aschem? You're comparing it to nachala to tell you. Not nachal, just like inheritance, there's no stopping, meaning inheritance continues and goes and then goes and goes and goes. Av Ma'aser Rishon, so to the first type that goes to Levi, there's no stop. Every single year, it's going to be going to the Levi, and that's how we know that in the third and the sixth year, although you stop Ma'aser Sheni, but you don't stop Ma'aser Rishon. And the gear says Tanam Hachi, similar in the Brisa. It says in the pasuk, when you're going to finish giving your tithing, etc., of the Shnas HaMaiser, which is Shana Shein Ba'ela Ma'aser Echad, is a year that only has one tithing. Okay, so how so? So Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Ani, it means you're not going to give this, I mean you're going to give Ma'aser Rishon like you gave the previous year. That's the one tithe you're going to do, and you're going to add on Ma'aser Ani. But a Ma'aser Sheni Yivatel, you're not going to give, you're going to stop the Ma'aser Sheni that you gave in the previous years. Yochel of Ma'aser Rishon Nam Yivatel, you think, also, maybe Ma'aser Rishon you also not give. You're saying Shnas HaMaiser, there's one Ma'aser. Maybe that one is the Ma'aser Ani, not the one of the two that you had last year, which is Ma'aser Rishon. Tamalim, no, it says in the pasuk, and this is a different interpretation. We're going to quote the other interpretation. That's why some say Tanya Idach or Tanam Hachi, because we're actually saying two interpretations here in this brisa. But this pasuk says Uvaha Levi. The Levi comes for his Ma'aser Rishon. What does that mean? Calls Man Shabbat. Why say and he comes? Because anytime that he comes, then you give it to him. And moreover, Rashi says this pasuk actually is in the third year because it says Miktei Shalosh Shanim Uvaha Levi. So if it's at the end of the third year, and you told me in the third year, and the third year, which is the question that we have when you give Ma'aser Ani, we were questioning, maybe only give Ma'aser Ani, don't give Ma'aser Rishon. No, in the third year, this pasuk is saying, Avaha Levi, that he's going to come in the third year, and you're going to give him then also. So therefore, the Rabbi Yehuda says, that's what you see, that you do have Ma'aser Rishon in the third and the sixth year too. Now, he says the interpretation we had said previously. He says, no, you don't have to come onto this drasha of Avaha Levi. Because the pasuk says, "Ve'elvim to Davi," you should speak to Levim. You should tell them, that you can take from the Jewish people the tithing that I give to them. That's from them, from their inheritance. Hikisha kosam nachla, like we said before. The pasuk is equating meister to a nachla. Man nachla in lahefsik, just like inheritance has no stop. Of meiser rishon in lahefsik, so the meiser rishon doesn't have a stop, and that's how we know that it continues to go in the third and the sixth year too. And that's the two sources that we have for this halacha. How we know meiser rishon applies in all the years, even though you don't give meiser sheni, you are still going to have, besides the meiser ani, also the meiser rishon. Now, the third item mentioned in the Brisa, we had mentioned the Mishnah Yerakis, that the Rosh Hashanah was the first of Tishrei. And therefore we mentioned the Brisa that says Maestris, Yerakis, and now we explain why it has to say both. Yerakis is because it's Maestris Derabanan, and regarding Mais, that's Yerakis, and Maestris regarding Maestris Daraisa, which is Dogin Tishrei Yeditza. The third item mentioned in the Brisa was Ulun Nidar, that Nedarim, its Rosh Hashanah is the first of Tishrei. So what does that mean? So Talmud Linda Brisa elaborates and explains what this case actually talking about. What do you mean? There's a vow. There's a Rosh Hashanah for a vow. Hamuda no mechamer l'shana. Let's say someone took a vow prohibiting himself to have pleasure from his friend for a year. So he says, we're breaking up. I don't want to have any benefit from you for this whole year. I don't want to be dependent on you. So so they count 12 months from day to day, a whole year. Now, but let's say he says for this year, even if it's the end of Chodesh El, the 29th of El, once it reaches Rosh Hashanah, next day, also Shana. It was already, the year's done. This year ends for the Nedarim on Rosh Hashanah, and it's over. And Rashi and the Gemara explains, even according to the one that holds that one day in the year is not considered a year. We had this in the inverse in the previous stuff regarding the one who says that it is, it's not going to be. Here's saying, even the one who holds one day in the year is not a year, so how could you say that the year is done? Says, you don't understand. This guy who took a neder, he was coming to pain himself when he was taking such a neder. And he pained himself, meaning usually you won't say a day is a year, because a guy's not going to rent an apartment less than 30 days, and generally you don't say it's like a year. But here, the objective of the neder was to pain himself. Ultimately, he pained himself, and now the cutoff is the next day, and if it's considered, even according to that mandama, like as if he fulfilled his vow. But the Gemara says, wait a second. Name and Nisan. We know there's two basic Rosh Hashanahs in the year, Nisan and Tishrei. So why are you saying that for a vow, the cutoff, the new year, this year is Tishrei? Maybe it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Says the Gemara, no, but the Darim halach achalosh me'adam. When it comes to vows, you go after the way people speak, where a person usually calls Rosh Chodesh Tishrei as Rosh Hashanah. And you say Rosh Hashanah. Oh, which Rosh Hashanah is? Daled Rosh Hashanah in Masechtas Rosh Hashanah. We learned this. 4 Rosh Hashanahs. Which Rosh Hashanah are you talking about? Come on, do me a favor. How do people usually speak? When you say Rosh Hashanah, you mean Aleph Tishrei. That's what we call Rosh Hashanah, and that's why the Nedarim, the Rosh Hashanah is going to be Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Now, continuing on this, previous items we mentioned the Brisa, which was really what we started off the Daf with, what we said from our Mishnah. We said the Rosh Hashanah for Yerakis is on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So, continuing on this theme, Tznan Hasam. We learned within the Mishnah Masechtas Meisters that says Hatilsan. Tilsan is a type of a spice, what's Rashi called fenugreek, is mishatitzmach. So when it sprouts, that's when you qualify its meiser. Like we mentioned before, many different types of vegetation have different years of when you qualify its year for meiser. So unlike, let's say, by Yerakis, which we said it goes based on the kita when you actually are gathering the vegetables, when it comes to this spice, fenugreek, you go based on when it sprouts. Now, hatavua, regarding grain, which actually Rashi says tavua actually includes dagan, which we usually translate as grain, and tirish, which is wine, which we also call tavua. As he brings the pasuk about Midbar Yitchas, kitavuas garin v'kitavuas Yaakov. You see that garin and Yaakov, which is grain and wine, are both called tavua. So regarding tavua, v'hazesim, and regarding olives, which is yitzar, which those are the three biblical elements that have the chiva meiser, dagan, tirish, v'yitzar. So those three are mishiviu shlish, meaning when we're qualifying which year of meiser it's in, which we said the Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, but how do I know which year to qualify it based on what part of its production? The meiser goes after the year where it had reached a third of its maturity, whether it be the second year or the third year. It's going to go based on when it developed a third. That's what the Mishnah says in Masechtas Meiser. Now the question is, my Mishnah Titzmach, what does it mean that by fenugreek we're going to go based on when it sprouts? So the Mishnah says Mishnah Titzmach Lizroy, meaning when the seed sprouts inside of the fenugreek, that's considered that it's Mishnah Titzmach, and that's going to be, if it sprouted the seed inside of it, that's considered now, whichever year that happened in, that's the year of Meiser we're going to consider it. And when we say Hatavu of Azesim, we said there in the Mishnah is Mishaviu Shlish. We said when it develops a third of its maturation, that's the year that it's considered for the year of its Meiser. Says the Gemara Menon Amili, where do we know this from? As Rashi explains, why is the Gemara specifically asking where do we know it from on the Tavua, the Zesim, from meaning Dagan, Tirish, V'yitzar, on the grain and the wine and the oil? Because, as we mentioned before, their Meiser is biblical. How do you know you go based on when it develops a third? Because regarding Yerakis, let's say, regarding vegetables, which we said the Rabbanan go after with Lakita, when you actually gather it from the field. Or let's say a tree, When you go based on chanata, which when it develops, when it matures the fruit, when it brings forth the fruit, those maisus are rabbinic. So we don't have a question. Where do we know this from? Because the Gemara later on, Daf Yudal tells us the reasons over there. Let's say by Yerakas, the reason is because it's constantly cut, and then they sprout, and they grow based on the rainwater. So therefore, it goes based on when the Lakita is, because the rainwater is of the year of when it's harvested. That's what makes it develop. Or let's say a tree, it grows based on the year of when the Chanita happens, when it brings forth the fruit, because it's through the sap in the tree, which comes right before the Chanata. That's how the produce develops and it finishes, and the sap of the tree is constantly going into the fruits. So again, that's what makes it grow, and then we're going to say that that's considered the year for the maisus. But those are rabbinic law, and they give the reasons for it. We're going to biblical law, which we're not, the rabbis are not giving the reason. The Torah obviously is creating this dynamic. The question is, where do we know that from? That the Torah tells us, but by the biblical maisus of Dagan Tishbiyat, so it's going to go based on if the year that it developed the third. Well, no, so that's right. So that's when you actually become mechuyevin. Your chiyuv starts. But there's another element which is okay. But what year is this from? I mean, when is it considered that it's a tevel, that it's a finished product? Not you regarding your chiyuv. Your chiyuv, the trigger happens when you actually bring it into bnei abayis. But when is this item considered a finished a pre? That depends if we go likito or on the hashrasha, on the chanata, or like we're saying regarding dagan tishri yitzah, when it develops a third. Your chiyuv doesn't start until you bring in bnei abayis, but this is already considered a davar hamechuyev of a meiser once it let's say regarding dagan tishri yitzah, it develops a third. So how do you know that from? So Mavasi Rabbi Yechanan umatibo and some lean it mishmeited Rabbi Yisrael Glili, because some of the Pasuk says in the Van, it says Mekei Shebesham at the end of the 7 years, b'moishnas the shmita in the Yom Tiv, in the Shemitah year, B'chag HaSukkos, in the Yom Tiv of Sukkos. So then there would be something they would do, Hakil, would bring all the Jewish people. Now, the one thing is, but Shnas HaShemitah, my Avedete B'chag HaSukkos. How are you mentioning Shemitah to call Sukkos that's at the end of the 7 years, Shnas HaShemitah, but you already finished Shemitah after Rosh Hashanah, right in the 8th year. So Sheminas here, it's the 8th year, why calling it Shemitah? Lemachar has come to tell you, any produce that already matured a third of it in the Shemitah year, Lefnei Rosh Hashanah, you're going to treat it with the halachic status of Shemitah in the 8th year, meaning it's really like a parenthetical derivation, meaning the Pasuk is telling you that there's something that could be in the 8th year, but it could be forbidden as if it's the Shemitah year. So although we're not even talking about it, we're talking about something very different, but it's alluding to which Tosfos discusses. We didn't really learn that somewhere else. Whatever. Akabanim, what we're learning out here is that it's telling us that, yeah, although I'm really in the 8th year on Sukkos, but really I'm going to call it Shemitah. Why? Because you could have stuff that are finishing in the 8th year, but I'm going to consider it as Shemitah. How so? If it grew a third in the Shemitah year, so it only grew a third, but the remaining 2/3 is growing in the 8th year, it doesn't make a difference. I'm going to consider that as if it's the Shemitah produce. Now later on the Gemara is going to ask on the next Daf, how do you know that it grew a third to tell me that if I'm taking it on Sukkos, that it grew a third and that's going to make it forbidden because of the Shemitah year. But right now, one thing you see from the Pasuk where our Daf will end is that you could be in the 8th year and still going to consider it as Shemitah because it grew a third in the Shemitah year, and hence, although it's in the 8th year when I'm taking this produce, I'm going to consider it as Shemitah produce because it grew a third, because again, like we said, regarding Dagan Terah Shviyitza, we don't go based on when you're actually doing the Lakita, when you're actually gathering, when you're harvesting, the Ketzira. No, we're going to go based on when it grew a third, and since it grew a third in the Shemitah year, I'm going to say it's going to be Usr because of the Shemitah year, even though again, I'm taking it here in Sukkot in the 8th year. Thank you to any time for listening to us.
The same thing is true also when you go in